World News, I'm Karen Giannoni. Our top stories: African leaders pay tribute to Robert Mugabe, who's died aged 95. He's praised for his leadership of the independence struggle, but others say Zimbabweans suffered too long under his rule.
He is our former president, and he liberated us from the colonists, as well as giving us land.
He was a dictator to others, he was a hero to others, so he has done a lot for other people, but other people think he was a bad guy.
The aftermath of the disaster in the hurricane-ravaged Bahamas fears that the number of deaths there will be staggering. Getting to grips with Brexit, a turbulent week for Britain's Prime Minister ends with opposition parties uniting to block a snap general election in October. And an emergency summit to save the Amazon rainforest. We'll bring you the latest. Hello, welcome to BBC World News. A liberation hero and towering figure in African history, or a ruthless dictator who turned his country into a pariah state and led his people into poverty. Two views of one man, Robert Mugabe, the former president of Zimbabwe, who's died at the age of 95 in a hospital in Singapore. African leaders have been paying tribute to him, with the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa praising him as a towering leader of the independence struggle. Britain, though, said Zimbabweans had suffered for too long under his rule. From Zimbabwe, our correspondent, Shingai Nyoka.
He was once Zimbabwe's liberator, leading a war against white minority rule. But by the end, the adulation President Robert Mugabe once enjoyed was gone. He cemented his power, winning overwhelmingly at elections in 1980. As leader of a new nation, he set about creating a better country than the one he inherited. And for a while, he succeeded.
There can never be any return to the state of armed conflict which existed before our commitment to peace and the democratic process of election under the Lancaster House Agreement. Surely, this is now time to beat our swords into plowshares.
But beneath the veneer lay a dark side. Mr. Mugabe deployed a crack military unit to southern Zimbabwe to deal with hundreds of insurgents. Between 1983 and 1987, thousands were murdered, and the world turned a blind eye. Mugabe was the great hope. But as the 1990s ended, the economy was bottoming out, and a new political party was on the rise. Seemingly desperate to regain popularity, Mr. Mugabe played a political hand. Land seized by the colonial government was still in the hands of the white minority. Sensing the frustration, Mugabe encouraged blacks to take back their land, and they did, often violently. The Western world took note, breaking diplomatic ties and imposing economic sanctions. The opposition, its leaders, human rights workers bore the brunt of his anger. In 2008, in the midst of billion% inflation and widespread unemployment, Mr. Mugabe suffered his first electoral defeat. It only led to more violence in the second round of voting. Britain stripped him of his knighthood, and former allies condemned him.
Nearer to home, we had seen the outbreak of violence against fellow Africans in our own country, and the tragic failure of leadership in our neighboring Zimbabwe.
But he remained a cult-like figure among many Africans for daring to challenge Western political dominance on the world's affairs.
In retaliation for the measures we took to empower the black majority, the United Kingdom has mobilized her friends and allies in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand to impose illegal economic sanctions against Zimbabwe.
But within his own party, discontent was rising. Many believed he had overstayed and needed to hand over power. His second wife, Grace Mugabe, 40 years his junior, seemed to be gaining power, and she began accusing then Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa of trying to oust them. Mr. Mugabe finally fired his longtime aide, accusing him of trying to topple him. Mr. Mnangagwa, with the help of the military, mounted a comeback, posting soldiers on the streets and placing Mr. Mugabe under house arrest. Tens of thousands of Zimbabweans marched, calling on him to step down. And after the threat of impeachment, he resigned. In his last years, Mr. Mugabe had retreated to the seclusion of his mansion. Many will remember him as a gifted orator and visionary who liberated Zimbabwe, but later returned her to the shackles of oppression.
Shingai Nyoka with that report. Well, Robert Mugabe died in the hospital in Singapore where he'd been treated for several months. Our correspondent Karishma Vaswani has the latest from there.
I'm standing in front of the prestigious and exclusive Gleneagles Hospital here in Singapore, which is where it's thought that Robert Mugabe spent a fair amount of time. In fact, the last few months of his life. He was frequently spotted here receiving medical treatment for a condition that we don't know at this point, but he also had links to Singapore. One of his children, his daughter, graduated from a private university here, and he was spotted at that graduation photograph there. His wife, Grace Mugabe, often accompanied him on these trips, and she was also seen in some of Singapore's most expensive shopping districts carrying lots of shopping bags. Now, it's not clear what condition he died of. But the Singapore Health Science Authority has told the BBC that there was no coroner or police at his death, which appears to suggest that he may have well have died of natural causes. At this point in time, the Singapore government is keeping rather tight-lipped about his death, but that's understandable given that he was such a high-profile figure in international politics.
Karishma Vaswani, Abaco Islands, where hundreds of people are still missing. Richard Galpin has the latest.
It's hard to imagine how anyone can survive neighbouring islands.
I honestly believe Abaco is finished. I think Abaco will not recover until the next 10 years. Like fully recover, because everything is gone. Absolutely everything is gone.
And that includes food. Inevitably, some people have been breaking into shops to find something to eat and drink, as supplies become increasingly scarce. Small amounts of food are being brought in by NGOs, and the United Nations is now promising to fly in 85 tons of ready-to-eat meals. But when this will arrive is unclear. So many here are trying to leave.
Me, I supposed to leave, but I can't. But no water, no food. You and me, nobody can stay there, because if you stay there, but couple days pass, but you will feel sick. You and me, but my plan that's leave. Find some places to live.
There's also no power here. Generators are needed urgently. But the international response to this disaster is only building up slowly.
Whilst airports on the islands are slowly becoming more operational and small flights going in and out, the clearance process is still going. There are roads that are damaged, We expect this to change rapidly over the next couple of days, but it is still a challenging situation.
Hurricane Dorian has also been causing problems, albeit at a much smaller scale, here in the United States, with high winds and flooding in South Carolina. And although Dorian's now been downgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, there are still warnings of storm surges and flash floods. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Let's look at some of the day's other news stories. The American rapper Nicki Minaj has announced her retirement from the music industry. The star, famous for hits like Anaconda and Starships, announced the news on Twitter. She told fans she'd decided to retire in order to focus on having a family. It's not yet clear whether Minaj plans to take a temporary or permanent break. Two-time Olympic 800-metre champion Caster Semenya has joined a South African women's football team. She's currently unable to compete in athletics without taking testosterone-reducing drugs following a rule change by athletics governing body. She's now training with Gauteng-based women's football club JVW. A 73-year-old woman in the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh has given birth to twin girls. They were born following IVF treatment on Thursday. The woman says she and her husband always wanted children, but had been unable to conceive until now. Let's take you straight to the Zimbabwean capital, Harare, and the State House there, where President Emmerson Mnangagwa is giving a statement to the nation.
The death early this morning in Singapore of the founder of our nation and iconic leader of our struggle for national liberation, Comrade Robert Mugabe, leaves a big void in our nation. A veteran nationalist and a dogged Pan-Africanist fighter, Comrade Mugabe bequeaths a rich and indelible legacy of tenacious adherence to principle on the collective rights of Africa and Africans in general, and in particular the rights of the people of Zimbabwe, for whom he gave his all to help free. In his life and political career, met and melded key phases, moods and shifts in the story of our national struggle and the quest for freedom and statehood, including the tragedies, pains and rigors which underwrote that epic story. Incarcerated for 11 years in settler colonial prisons, he, alongside fellow nationalists who included late Father Zimbabwe, Comrade Joshua Mkabuko Nkomo, remained bold and resolute, eventually escaping from the then Rhodesia in 1974 in order to lead and guide the resumption and escalation of our war of liberation. The struggle regained momentum, expanded and consolidated, transforming the Patriotic Front into a formidable, coordinated national liberation movement and a fighting force capable of waging one of the most grueling and protracted struggles in the South African region. Today, our country is free. It has been since 1980, thanks to the sacrifices of a generation of dedicated veteran nationalists and freedom fighters, predating the 1960s, who included the late Comrade Mugabe. A great teacher and a mentor, the bitterness of long spells in incarceration and the anguish of a brutal and a bitter war never extinguished Comrade Mugabe's forgiving inner humanity. That humanity shone and diminished throughout that season of war and forcefully asserted itself by way of the signature policy of national reconciliation on which our whole statehood was founded and built. Through that policy of forgiveness, Southern African politics took a definitive shift towards a just, post-conflict, multiracial harmony, which would be replicated elsewhere in our region and beyond. He thus wrought a lasting purge on nation building and statecraft for the world, making him stand out as such a remarkable statesman of our century. Apart from landmark post-independence transformations in areas of rights, education, social services for the hitherto marginalized black Zimbabweans, the late departed icon will be eternally remembered and honored for the bold and historic land reform program which he undertook. Through this program, indigenous Zimbabweans regained their long denied land rights to complete their sovereignty. For that, he was especially vilified, shunned, and punished by those who stood to lose from an end to colonial rights and from a just reassertion of African rights. With characteristic defiance, he stood firm and undaunted, resolutely pressing on with the land reform program to completion, all against formidable odds, which included punitive sanctions and other reprisals that followed, and which still dog us to this day. Today, Zimbabwe's land question itself a principal grievance of our struggle stands fully and irrevocably addressed and resolved. History will remember him for this bold move. As we mourn the passing on of our commander, liberator, founder, and leader, we remain determined to carry forward the transformation he so fervently desired, including protecting and defending the gains of the struggle for which he made huge sacrifices. On the bedrock and the solid foundation of the First Republic, which he molded as its leader, we today recover and grow our economy, brick by brick, until his lifelong vision of an empowered people is realized. On behalf of our nation, that of my family, and on my own behalf, I wish to express my deepest heartfelt condolences to the Mugabe family, to my Grace Mugabe, and the children especially, on this their saddest loss. My Mugabe stood by her husband to the very end, thus imparting to our nation a lasting lesson on devout love and care, For that, we deeply thank her as we join her in the grief of loss and bereavement, which is also ours to feel and bear. ZANU-PF, the party which the late departed helped found, has met and accorded him national hero status, which he earned and richly deserves. Let me also register the gratitude of government and our entire nation to the government and people of the Republic of Singapore for the unmatched hospitality and medical care they extended to our leader up to the very end. In particular, we are most grateful to the team of medical experts and support staff which cared for him with such great diligence, dedication, and compassion. They did all they could up to the very end. As we await the arrival of the remains of our dear departed icon, we pray that the good Lord grant him mercies, putting his dear soul to eternal rest. We as Zimbabweans declare days of mourning for our leader until he is buried. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade President. Thank you.
Well, that is Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa, a long-time ally of President Mugabe, paying glowing tribute, recalling Robert Mugabe as a liberation hero of the independence struggle, the founder of the National Liberation Movement, talking about how our country is first statesman of our century. He also talked about how he would be eternally remembered and honoured for the bold land reform programme, that highly controversial land reform programme that the country undertook, and said he'd been vilified, shunned and punished by those who stood to lose from the end of colonial rights. We will have plenty more on the death of Robert Mugabe in the next edition of BBC World News and Focus on Africa in the next hour or so. Now let's move on. Images of the Amazon rainforest, the so-called lungs of the world on fire, have triggered international outrage. Now several leaders from countries in the region are meeting right now in Colombia to talk about how to stop them. There will be one noticeable absence though. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro is missing the summit to prepare for surgery. He's been widely criticised for failing to protect the Amazon. Let's go over to Will Grant, who's covering this from Mexico City. And Will, what sense of urgency do you sense about this taking place in Colombia?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the Colombian president is sort of hosting the other nations. And I think the specific point they chose was quite symbolic. It's a town called Leticia, which borders Colombia and Brazil and has undergone extreme deforestation in recent years. So, you know, obviously it's an important point to bring together the various different countries that have Amazon territory, and I think that's one of the key points that Mr. Bolsonaro, who, to be fair to him, was one of those who proposed this meeting after he was in such locking horns with the G7 nations over the state of the Amazon and the wildfires, although, as you said in your introduction, he won't actually be there himself because he is about to undergo a hernia operation.
Well, you've been visiting the fires yourself. I mean, just tell us the sense you got of the scale of the devastation and how it's continuing.
Right, well, although I speak to you now from Mexico, I was in the Amazon just last week and flying over those wildfires, and, you know, it is breathtaking, the scale of the devastation. It is, it's upsetting, it is difficult to look at. We saw almost no evidence whatsoever of anyone doing anything to tackle them. And certainly on the ground where the fires were, there was nothing going on. In the town nearby of Porto Velho, there was some action, some gathering of troops and so on, but it looked woefully inadequate for the scale of the issue. Now, Mr. Bolsonaro's foreign minister has spoken to the press, and he says no, that the wildfires are now under control. But if you speak to the environmentalists, they say these are the worst months: September, October, very, very dry, and so the fires themselves are continuing.
What sort of action is being talked about, is being called for at this summit, and how much help do you think they want from the rest of the world?
Well, this is the difficulty. I mean, without Mr. Bolsonaro there, although he is supposed to speak to them via video conference call, one wonders what the final pact will actually be able to achieve, given that Brazil has the largest territory of the Amazon of all the nations who are due to attend. On top of which, they're talking about measures, they're talking about an itinerary that will take place. We've already seen they were in conflict with the G7 over the offer of 20 million euros that was going to be given to help tackle the wildfires. And when Mr. Bolsonaro continues to talk about opening up the region to mining and to agribusiness, one wonders what this will achieve at all.
Will, thank you very much. Will Grant there, covering that summit that's taking place in Colombia from Mexico City. Let's just remind you of our main news this hour, because African leaders have been paying tribute to the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who has died at the age of 95. Just in the last few minutes, the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has paid a glowing tribute to him, saying he is a great statesman of the century.
Hello, very mixed weather fortunes across